Hello, I'm Chris Athanas. I'm a KMP developer. Tech support said they're coming out on Tuesday. Close that up. Today we're going to be talking about or I'm going to be reacting to one of the best videos I've seen about cloud services. When I first got into cloud services, there was so much crazy stuff going on about all the different things, and they all sound, oh, this is really different. Oh, this one's really different. It's like, no. Turns out it's all pretty much the same kind of stuff. Somebody else's machine running some little piece of software, running it into a database, saving it into a file system, which is just a database, or running some sort of proprietary process or whatever, some standardized library, and then dumping the results someplace else, like a database. Oh, no, they're all different. Oh, so 374 different types of services on Amazon Web Services. Oh, really? Okay. Well, okay, let's get started.
Nobody wants to host their own database. AWS isn't doing anything creative. They're actually just taking open source software. Logic-wise, we can do pretty much everything with these services. Nowadays, there's so many different cloud services that even just knowing the names of all the services that AWS offers is...
This is NeatCode.io. Give him a like and subscribe. He's pretty cool. He actually has obviously been done in the trenches because he's seeing the same thing I did, but breaks it down just a really great way. Okay, shut up, Chris.
difficult, let alone understanding what they actually do. Well, the good thing is that I'm going to explain to you why most of the cloud services are all really the same under the hood. And I'm also going to be giving you roughly my top 5 services that you should actually understand and know. And everything else is just a repackaging of those top 5. We're going to go even deeper than that and learn about the differences between managed and unmanaged services, because I think that's kind of a buzzword nowadays. It kind of gets into the whole meaning of what does serverless actually mean. We'll also touch on...
I am kind of a fan of maybe doing on-prem for these kinds of businesses I'm talking about, starting with these micro SaaS regional businesses, capping at 100,000 customers tops, maybe 200,000 tops. And you can use an on-prem. You don't have to spend money on these web servers. You know how much you're going to spend. You have the servers right there. It's running Redis or whatever. You have a T1 line, or maybe that's your expense instead of renting out the cloud services, or just run it off a normal 100 megabit per second. It's pretty big pipe. I mean, for what I'm talking about, people doing, which is running micro SaaS services. Yeah, running most of the database locally and maybe having the file saving someplace else on the CDN. Maybe that makes sense, but I mean, having a local on-prem, it's not that bad running these things now. It's not like the bad old days of 2004, 2006, when you're running you have to configure these Linux things. It's not that bad anymore. Well, okay, let me get into it.
On the difference between a regional and a global service, and we'll also be talking about all kinds of different cloud services and providers, from the big boys like AWS, GCP, as well as the startups, Vercel, kind of the mid-sized companies like Snowflake, Datadog.
Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud Provider. Ooh, same somebody else's machines, a server farm somewhere running some software. Go ahead.
And kind of talk about how they fit into the overall picture. Now, the single most important service to know, and to know really well, is something that you're probably already familiar with. You can, in a sense, rent a computer as a service. It's called a VM, a virtual machine.
I also call them VPS, virtual private server. It's all the same stuff. It's just another one of your Linux boxes that you're probably running on. Probably watching this on a Linux box. If it's a Mac, it's all the same stuff underneath. It's just like a CPU somewhere on the network.
Now, technically, you might not be renting a physical computer, but you can think of it as that because you'll have resources allocated to your VM. For example, some CPU, some amount of RAM, disk space, which you can usually add on to. So from your perspective, you're getting a computer. Well, it turns out that pretty much every single service is built on top of this. Any cloud service you're going to use is, in a sense, built on top of VMs. If you want to run some type of compute or server, it's going to be running on top of some type of machine using some CPU and other resources. If you want to store a bunch of files, it's going to be stored on top of a computer, because even though the files are going to be stored probably on disk, well, to read and write to those files, you're going to need some type of computer. To run a database, I probably don't have to tell you, it's going to require all of these. Everything is just built on top of computers. And pretty much every cloud provider will offer something like this. Amazon has EC2, Google has Compute Engine, I'm sure.
Elastic Cloud, EC2 is such a bad name. It's just another machine somewhere on one of those server farms.
Azure has their own. The good thing about these is that they're so extensible. If you really wanted to, you don't need any of those other services. You can do everything you need to using just VMs. And so this is an example of an unmanaged service, because the cloud provider isn't really doing anything other than provisioning the resources and then letting you do whatever you want to.
Yeah, you can put your database on there. You can put I've got a VPS. I'm running I think I got my Tasky running on there. And Google Kong, another my sketch a sketch game is on there. I think another server is on there. So yeah, I mean,
too. And of course, they're not going to like physically mail the VM to you. You're going to be connecting to it remotely, probably.
it's cheap, and you're capped on how much you get charged, and they have they're making sure the server's on and up. So they're they're so cheap. So having a VPS running yourself, you can run at least 10,000, maybe 20,000 clients on $10-$20 a month, um, or just do it on prem. Hook up open up a port to one of your home server and run it there. Why not? It's cheap. It's super cheap. You can run I get a little what is it? Those little Raspberry Pi boxes, or just a cheap laptop. Why not?
Probably via SSH. Now, what if you want to store some files, such as images, videos, and other types of assets that you probably need for your app? Yeah, you can store them on the VM.
And if you're talking about the denial of service, you can still put a Cloudflare in front of that, in front of your server, and like go through that first till before it hits you, or just put rate limiters on there. So what? I mean, nobody's gonna attack your stuff. I mean, not when you're tiny and small. I mean, maybe eventually, but that's just part of doing business. You have to figure out. Just put the Cloudflare in front of it. That's fine. You don't have to worry about it anymore.
And then serve them from the VM, that would work, but computers aren't specialized for handling files. So a better solution, a more scalable solution, and just more efficient in general, is to use some type of file storage mechanism. On AWS, it's called S3, Simple Storage Service. It's basically an object store. That's what they're called. And so an object store is kind of like a black box, even though I've drawn it as like a white box here, but all you really do is read and write files to it. You can delete files, of course, but it's very simple. The interface from a programming perspective is really, really simple compared to manually handling files via like a VM. You don't worry about where they're being stored. You don't worry about allocating additional space. With a VM, you'll have, let's say, like 100 gigabytes or something. You try to upload a file and you run out of space. You don't have space. On cloud services, it's easy to get more space, but it's something you still have to kind of manage yourself as a developer.
Right, your app and maybe your accounts are on there, or maybe you could put some data on there. It depends how many clients you have. But eventually you're gonna have to do something. You're gonna have to, if you have 100,000 clients, you're gonna have some sort of file storage system, and maybe you could do it on prem. I don't know, maybe not. I would definitely consider it.
Well, object stores like S3 abstract all of that away for you. You'll never run out of space. You'll probably never need to do anything to scale your read and writes. Now, as you can imagine, these files are still being stored somewhere. They're being stored on a disk somewhere persistently. And to read and write the files, of course, you're using CPU and probably RAM. But again, you don't have to worry about that. This is an example of a managed service because AWS or your cloud provider is managing all the infrastructure for you. It's also sometimes called serverless, but it's not to say that there isn't a
Just not your server. It's still a server, but it's not your server.
Server involved. There definitely is. You can't do any of this stuff without computers, but it's abstracted away from you, and that's really powerful.
Right, you're not running your own virtual private server somewhere that's accessing the bucket. It's not running somewhere. The bucket's got its own API. It's running. You just say you save this file here, save this file there. You're not running a server to save the file. So that's the S3 serverless thing. Okay.
Because all you have to do is worry about your application logic, reading and writing the correct files. You don't worry about the infrastructure at all. It's obviously less powerful in the sense that you don't have precise control over what this service is doing, but you usually have enough control. Like if you wanted your files to be stored in a particular region, usually services like this will let you choose the region that you want to. They'll usually also automatically replicate files for you. So that's another benefit of using a managed service, because if we stored a file on our own.
Right. So with your own thing, you still have to handle your backups and how all that handles. And now we assume, we assume they're handling backups properly, but on a managed service. But if you do your own, if it's unmanaged, you have to do your own server backups. Don't skip that step.
VM. What if the VM dies or some type of hardware failure? Well, if you only stored it on one computer, you lose that data that was on that disk. Well, object stores solve this problem by replicating the files for you. Now, object stores are good for storing data, but they're not good at storing everything. What if you had actual application data, not files and images, but like you want to store your database data? Well, databases are really, really complicated. So you usually want to run some type of specific database software like MySQL or some other type of relational.
Yeah, for the kinds of apps that I'm talking about, these microSaaS apps, Redis. You can avoid a lot of latency issues. You can scale like a mug on that thing, and you can also easily go from on-prem to off-prem and to a managed service with Redis. I love Redis. Redis is awesome. I mean, it gets rid of a lot of issues, a lot of problems that it comes with MySQL and just latency problems. And if you applications that how I recommend applications to be written with the Allen K style OOP, the Boop style, which I've got on my free course. I talk a little bit about that. Uh, yeah, Redis it really handles that use case very well. Okay, keep going.
or non-relational storage. Like databases are basically just a really, really complex wrapper over these resources, particularly disk space. Well, of course, if you want to, you can just run your own MySQL on top of a VM, and you can replicate it among other VMs if you want to, like create replicas of it. If you wanted to do sharding and scale your database like that, you can have some of your data split among the machines. That's
So sharding just means geographically splitting the database. Okay, so if you're in Texas, you only get only the people in Texas. All the data is stored in the Texas database. And then you have another region in New York, and then LA, and they're stored locally because you get faster speed because you're not as far away. It's not as many hops on the internet. And that's the whole point of sharding. That is it.
doable, but it's complicated, isn't it? And so to
Yeah,
solve this,
it
cloud
is.
providers
So that's why I'm talking about these regional apps. Is you don't have to go sharding and figure out how to handle 100 million customers. You're only going to do 10,000, 100,000, maybe 200,000 if you're lucky. With these teams, we're going to have like 5 people. We're going to make it, 50 to 100K a month instead of 100 to 5, 10 million a year, 20 million a year, 30 million a year. It's like a small team making a lot of money, basically slicing off parts of the business models are already working. These companies got a little cocky, and this isn't going to just be this isn't for everyone, right? This is for people that have been in the business, have been in the industries, and they see some of the inefficiencies and and they can see these new tools that are available like Kotlin, where you can have your whole application, all your web, your iOS, your Android, your desktop, your servers, your all the whole thing is all one language, all sets of one libraries. That's all doing, even the UI. Okay, so if you get kicked out of the Android store for some reason, you can go to desktop. Okay, or you can go to the web, and it's all the same code. And that's a pretty big change. That's a very unusual. Usually, the JetBrains has been working on this for a long time, at least 10 years, and now they're people are about to find out about it, and that's why a lot of these companies may already know this already. I doubt it though. It's so new, but people like me and you know it. If you're on my channel, I can't stop talking about it.
will usually give you a managed solution for storing your data, your database data. In the world of AWS, it's RDS, Relational Database Service. That's if you want a relational database. There's also Dynamo if you want a non-relational database. Once again, the whole point of
SQL database. Ooh,
using a cloud service for this rather than hosting your own database.
Their different name for their little flavor that locks you in. And that's the other thing about these cloud service guys. That why you should consider doing your own if you can unmanaged, but don't try to do it all fancy, all the wizardry stuff. Just enough to get do your purpose and manage it and to and have analytics on it. But you're not trying to make $1 billion business. You're trying to make $100,000 business. It's 100 $1 million business or a $2 million business or $20 million business that can be we're taking a slice off somebody else's big players, a slice piece of their pie to get a negotiation position really well, or just run a business. What the hell? Why not?
Is because nobody
Some those companies aren't run as well as yours is. That's a shocker.
wants to host their own database. Nobody wants to deal with those issues unless they have to. Now is a good chance actually to talk about proprietary software. In many cases, AWS isn't doing anything creative. They're actually just taking open source software, kind of like we discussed right now. MySQL or Postgres is open source. To solve this problem of making the user experience better is just to take open source software and then host it and make a managed service out of it.
There's nothing special about database software, by the way. It's just opening and reading files. There's no magic. It's not doing anything magical there. It's just opening a file and writing in with the command structure that abstracts that stuff away, so you don't even know what hardware you're working on or what file system you're working on, whatever. It's kind of abstracted away, but that's all it's doing underneath the hood. I mean, you could write your own databases. You don't have to use theirs unless you're, if you're doing something really clever and specific. Yeah, okay, if it makes sense, but you don't have to. It's not required. I mean, people have used just JSON databases loaded into memory. If you've got 100,000 clients or whatever, maybe that's the fastest and best way to do it. RAM's cheap. These machines are cheap, especially you put it on prem and run Redis on it. I mean, who cares? It's so cheap now.
That's a lot of what relational database service does. But there is something else. DynamoDB, if you want to use this type of database, like this database service, you can only do so on AWS. So this is
right. That's the thing that teases did. And then the ingress free for free, but if you want to take your data off, you have to pay to leave. That's such a cheese. That is such typical stuff. That's why, burn me, fool me once, fool me once, my fault. I don't know how that saying goes, but if you get burned by these people, and the fees are just like, you can buy multiple machines and run them on prem for the amount you're running, get charged for these people after a while. And people just like forget. They just think there's, that's the only way to do it. It's like, no, there's this other way. You don't have to put your machine out there. They're not as hard as they used to be to set up. I mean, it's not that bad these days.
Example of proprietary software. If you built your app around DynamoDB and now you decide that it's costing you too much money, you want to move to a different service, well, you're gonna have to migrate all of your data because AWS is the only one who offers DynamoDB. If you want to go to Google Cloud, you can't.
They charge you for that, and you have to rewrite your app. That's a lot of fun.
Commonly talked about as vendor lock-in. Generally, you don't want to be locked in, but recognize that it's probably not going to be a problem unless your app actually starts scaling. Because if you're spending like $100 a month on DynamoDB, hopefully your company is making more than that much money. But if you start spending thousands and thousands, then it becomes an issue. And you'll also find that different companies have their own versions of databases. For example, Google's version of a DynamoDB would be either Firestore or Cloud Spanner. Microsoft has their own Cosmos DB, I think it's called. I've never used it. The idea is that once you know about one service, you know about like one database that AWS offers, then going to a different cloud provider is pretty trivial because they have their own version.
Well, not exactly trivial. They all have their little quirks and little things you have to know about, and if you don't get them right, you can lose all your data. So you have to be careful with all this lock-in vendor stuff. That's kind of becoming passe now. I feel open source solutions are the way to go. I mean, you really have to look at the money now, and they obscure it. They obscure how much it's going to cost until you're in there, until they got you. But these are the kinds of things you have to worry about if you're trying to be $1 billion company, right? Or $100 million company. But if you're trying to be a $1 or $2 million company a year, or $3 million, do you really need to worry about all this stuff? Once you get to that point, yeah, okay, we can start talking about it then. But like on the road there, you don't think you need that stuff.
So once you know one, you've learned the others. Like every cloud provider has an object store. They all have a VM service. They all have their own proprietary or open source database services.
Yeah, and they'll try to convince you it's so different. It's not. It's the same stuff. It's all the same stuff, but they'll all convince you it's different. Because it's sales guys, man. Come on. They got to get their sales numbers up. What do you think this is, America?
Talked about how a lot of services just take open source software and then just make a managed service out of it. Well, one of the services that didn't do that was AWS Lambda, commonly known as functions as a service. This was, in a sense, taking this CPU component, the compute component, like if you wanted to actually create an API or run some type of compute, not necessarily storing persistent data, you would use something called AWS Lambda, and pretty much every big cloud provider has.
It's just a thing that's responding to your custom written thing, endpoint for you. It's just always there, ready, running. And you get charged for every time you access it. Ooh, it's a Lambda. Ooh.
Copied it. Google has cloud functions. I'm sure Azure has their own. But the idea is all you have to do, you don't worry about the infrastructure at all. You don't worry about the VM, the disk. You hardly worry about the CPU and the RAM. You can set like memory limits.
Well, RAM and CPU you have to worry about. And disk is usually doing database calls to some other service. So you do have to worry about the disk somewhere.
And things like that. But basically, you take your code as a developer, and that code is pretty much deployed for you. You don't have to worry too much about the...
means it's just ready there to run. Anytime when you hit the endpoint for your Lambda, when your server accesses it or your mobile device accesses it, then it runs. But the machine's always running somewhere, and your job just comes up and starts running. And that's you don't so you don't actually have a server anywhere running that you log into. It's just an endpoint someplace. I mean, okay.
environment, you just take your code and it runs.
They made such a big deal about this stuff. And I guess it's because they had to sell it, but at the time they made it sound like this was like revolutionary. Oh my god, the most amazing thing ever. I think because of the zero interest rate environment, these salespeople got in and just still sold these people like they're going to be the next $1 billion Amazon company because they're working on Amazon hardware. It's like, no, no. And now they have to lay everybody off because it didn't quite work out right. That's why we got to take their lunch. It's time to take their lunch. They're incompetent. They're incompetent. You don't need 16 layers of management to run these things. No, I think Twitter showed we can probably take over some of these companies now, and we just hasn't got. Everybody's all depressed. I got laid off. Well, guess what? There's the opportunity. I've seen this before. This is not my first rodeo. Like I've been doing this business for a while, and every once in a while this happens. Like I remember when I was a kid, everyone had to talk about the big iron, IBM, unstoppable, the most amazing technology ever. And the microcomputers are like, no, no, no. We're small and little, and don't pay attention to us. We're silly. We're just hobbyists, right? And all of a sudden, it just whomped them into a period of like 10 years. They lost like 90% of their market share because people were like, we're just gonna use microcomputers. Oh, you can do like everything on these things. I don't need to like go set up a batch job and a COBOL configuration somewhere to run my stuff. Oh, but boom, and then it was off to the races. But so these things have happened before, and we're in one right now.
Runs. Now, the problem with functions as a service, this is one of the most serverless services that you can do. And the reason I say that is because serverless is really a spectrum. There are services that are completely managed by the cloud. Lambda would be a pretty good example of that. And then there are other services like VMs that are not managed at all. And then there are database services, which are half managed and half not sometimes.
I mean, you're just splitting hairs here, guy. But okay, we'll
DynamoDB is very managed, but
this is useful. Okay, shut up.
But the idea is that there's a spectrum, and Lambda or functions as a service abstract away pretty much everything for you, but that does come with some downsides. For example, if you want to manage any type of state in your API, which is becoming less and less common with REST APIs and microservices, you probably won't need to do that. But if you do, you probably won't be able to use Lambda unless you use.
You mean an in-memory state? Because you could have state set up in a database somewhere. Which state are you talking about? I guess he means like in-memory state, like state of a variable somewhere, which you wouldn't be doing with a Lambda anyway. You have to bring in all your data, do your processing, and throw it out someplace. You can't keep state inside it. That's silly. That's goofy. But I guess maybe with games, but even then, you're gonna have to dump that to disk and keep it in disk just for if the server goes down. So you shouldn't be really keeping state persistent anyway, as you should be relying on state. If it's in memory state, you should not be relying on that. That's goofy. Except for the most basic primitive apps. Let's keep going.
Use some type of external storage, because when you run a Lambda function, you don't really have access to your disk. That's abstracted away from you. It can be good sometimes and sometimes.
No, you can get access to your S3. I mean, you're talking about like a local disk? Yeah, of course. It's just a Lambda. It's just a piece of code that's running. If you want to get access to something, you have to get it over the network somewhere. So that's a little bit of the downside of these Lambdas. You want to get data in. If it's big, it's going to take a minute to get in there.
Sometimes it can be bad. So it depends on what type of problem you're trying to solve. But with Lambda, most APIs can be solved with this way. And if they can, why would you ever want to manage your own VM? It's a pain. So now if you just...
Because it's fast response time. There's no spin up times. It's always there. But other than that, I mean, you can... I don't know. They're basically doing the same thing. An API call to your VM running a server versus a Lambda call to somebody else's server that's running your Lambda. It's like it's all the same stuff. What is that? I mean, splitting hairs a little bit. It's like, what's your style? What makes sense for this particular application? I think for most micro SaaS, a VPS running a VM with some CPU and RAM and a disk is fine. And I like Redis, so making it a big RAM disk and having the disk dump off someplace else, or using the managed service from the Redis people, or just do it on prem. So what? Let's do it on prem. I bet you can get away with doing a lot of stuff on prem, a lot. You can go probably a couple of years on doing a micro SaaS on an on prem Redis. I've seen people with that configuration, it's like we don't have to worry about Amazon charges ever. We don't. There's not going to be any calls coming in about, hey, your account's been cut off because Amazon's down. Like you have to, you have to do your battery backup and all the stuff that goes with it. But I mean, people have gotten their companies have been folded because of AWS bills.
Just look at these four categories of services, you can build almost anything with these. The one big category
Yeah.
I've probably been lacking on is networking. I probably won't go super in depth into that. For example, like load balancers, CDNs, and things like that. But logic wise, we can do pretty much everything with these services. And you probably don't even need EC2. You don't need VMs because VMs you can handle everything with anyway. But just looking at this, we have
I mean, EC2 is a VM, so
persistent file storage, we have persistent like application data storage, and
I think he means the thing where it scales them up and scales them down. I wouldn't be worrying about that stuff anytime soon. If you're doing a micro SaaS for 100,000 people, don't worry about the scaling up and down. Now, build your application modularly, so maybe one day you're going to spit them all out, and that's I cover that in my course, the free course I have, about the Allen Case style. It makes it sense to set it up that way using sagas and that approach. So if you want to, if you need to scale the damn thing, okay. But in general, I wouldn't even worry about most of this stuff until you have 10,000 customers, and even when that happens, you'll be doing well at that moment, because if you have 10,000 customers and you have 3 or 4 people, and each customer is going to be has a valuable some value, 30 to $100, you're going to be okay.
we have compute. We can serve our front end or our back end. Where we go from here is kind of opinionated. So there's two categories I kind of wanted to talk about. One is just observability in general. And I'm not an expert when it comes to AWS with observability, but I think the services are going to be pretty similar to Google Cloud. But it's about like your logging, your monitoring data, and your alerts.
Yeah.
Being able to observe how
That stuff is super important, and I've seen engineers come in and get hired into companies and actually quit because these were not set up properly, and the company didn't have time to set them up. It was just bad scene. Yeah, these things are super critical, and you do have to think about them from the beginning when you're building your microservice applications. And that is one thing you do get with these managed services. You do get these things built in, but it's not going to be exactly what you need to know. So, I mean, eventually you have to make a dashboard for your microservice with all the monitoring and the alerts and the logging. And it's not that bad to roll your own. It's not super terrible. And it is useful to know how to do that, but it's not that bad figuring that stuff out, making a nice dashboard for it. If you've already built the microservice and know how that stuff works, it's not that much more.
how your application is running via like server-side logs or metrics. For example, if you want to see like how much CPU your VM
That's not my. Well, I mean, not much more for your particular microservice, right? For your particular business. When you have all this advanced logging stuff, you got to learn how all that stuff that works, how it's all put together, what it's actually monitoring. Is it giving you false values? Like, is it monitoring the things that you really need to know about, etc.
VMs are using, or how long your queries are taking. That would be monitoring data. And if
I mean, one of the companies I worked for had these alerts set up in one of the Slacks. It was just constantly going off, showing off graphs of all kinds of stuff. Who knows what it was? It's like the worst way to do monitoring is like putting in a Slack channel. And anytime something would go wrong, we'd send these alerts out, and everyone would get notifications. It's like, what are you doing?
if you
No. We get exposure. Everyone gets to see. It's like, this is just noise. This is all noise, guys. This is noise. I tried to I asked them, I was like, are we supposed to make head or tails of these logs? Like, no, no, you can ignore them. They're fine. It's like, well, then why are we even having this thing up here? And then the guy eventually quit. He's like, this is too much.
wanted to know if one of these services went down for some reason or the latency got too high, you'd probably want to be alerted of that via some push notification in real time. So that's
He was a good engineer too. I mean, but he was just like, no, this is not me. This is not sustainable.
what observability is about. And the big cloud providers have done a decent job of giving you tools for observability, but there actually are other services such as Datadog. It's a relatively big company actually, and their whole proposition is that they can handle observability better than the big cloud providers, even though there's actually a bit more friction in using one of these external tools.
Yeah, so if you roll your own, you're probably gonna want to use something like Datadog. I've heard some really good things about it. I don't know anything about the business, but I have heard good things about the monitoring that they have. So it may make sense to do that at some point. But in the beginning, no. I mean, just to make sure your thing's up and gives you an alert if it's not up anymore for some reason. That's pretty good to know. But a lot of this stuff is like you don't need to do it right in the beginning when you're working on it, when you're creating these things, and you don't need to pay for these services that you're probably not going to use. You're only going to use 10% of it anyway. I mean, that's why I'm saying is like people overkill. They think they're going to be the next Bill Gates, whatever, Mark Zuckerberg. It's like no, you're probably not. And let's calm down, be humble, do tests, and then become a micro Mark Zuckerberg. And that'll be a little more meaningful as well to build these things uh, from the scratch and knowing how they work and being able to train other people on them and stuff. And you're not trying to like take over the world, you're just taking over your block.
because there's more work involved in like setting up the monitoring agents and things like that. But generally speaking, people are big fans of services like Datadog because they make this stuff actually easier for you. It's not just that. When you think about something called data warehouses, the big cloud providers have, I think, AWS.
Hate that data warehouse. It's just a bunch of hard disks. Oh wow, it's a data warehouse. It's like no, it's just a bunch of hard disks. Okay, somebody put a terrorist. So they want to sell it. Oh, it's a data warehouse. Because all the business people know what a warehouse. Oh yeah, it's where you put all the product. You put the product in the warehouse, ready to be shipped off for profit. It's like it's just a bunch of hard disks that may fail. Come
Is called
on.
Redshift, Google has BigQuery, and they do a decent job.
Yeah,
Some of them do
whatever.
better than others, but even given that, there actually are other platforms like Snowflake, like Databricks, that are basically companies dedicated to solving these problems. And if they're spending all their energy on one specific area, then they think, and in many cases they do better than the big providers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to worry about this stuff. Don't worry about that stuff right now. Not for Microsoft stuff. Don't worry. Don't just eliminate that. My data warehouse, whatever. Just make sure your stuff's backed up somewhere. On S3 is pretty good, whatever. But like data warehouse, that's when you get acquired.
Tools like AWS have made
Somebody else
development
worry
so
about
much
it.
easier than it was 20 years ago where you needed your own servers. Still, people complain that AWS is really, really complicated to use. And so now there are companies like Vercel, which pretty much at a high level are wrappers around AWS. And I don't mean that as an insult because, in a sense, AWS is just wrappers around like other open source software. The
Yeah,
whole goal of these cloud providers is to give you an easier way to use AWS resources.
and lock you in.
Just like how these resources, RDS, functions as a service, they're just wrappers around VMs. Everything is just an abstraction on top of other things. And
Yeah.
that's okay because the whole point is to make development easier. Now, lastly, I wanted to talk.
Not always, sir. Sometimes it's meant to lock you in. And they tell you in the marketing demo, oh yeah, it's gonna make things so much easier. But then you get the bill. It's like, was it really worth this much more? I could have hired a couple guys to do it for this.
About the differences between regional and global services because it's kind of a buzzword. You see it thrown around a lot. The
Yeah, I'm mostly interested in this regional stuff. This global stuff, that that boat sailed in 2015. If you weren't on it, it's not coming back. Okay, but this regional stuff is wide open, wide open.
definition is kind of fuzzy. For example, if we talk about a content delivery network, a CDN, well, that's inherently a global service because you have a world map, and a CDN is basically just a distribution of servers around the world that store.
Ooh, it's servers. No, it's a CDN. It's a content delivery network. It's just servers that are local to you. No, it's really different. It's just servers, file servers that cache copies of whatever's being sent around. If they notice it's the same one, they just serve it from the local. That's all it is. No, it's different.
Or some
We don't really have to worry about CDNs too much with doing regional apps. I mean, for your websites or whatever, I guess maybe, but
static data usually. And so you can't really have a regional CDN. Now, take the other side, take a VM, for example. VMs are inherently.
I mean, you can have a regional CDN that just sits there and gives a cache local to the neighborhood. Maybe I don't know. It doesn't really make sense.
Regional. You can't have one VM split in 5 different regions, right? You just have one VM in a location. You can have a second VM somewhere else and a third one somewhere else. And
But you have multiple VMs. Traffic's like, I mean, okay.
you could have these VMs under a load balancer serving traffic in different parts of the world. That's perfectly fine. The service itself is regional, though. A VM is regional.
I mean, okay, he's talking about the service. So he's talking about the database and the RAM, the CPU, and the application. And that's what he means by service. Everyone uses that word service differently, so you have to be careful. You gotta make sure you've listened to their materials because they use it in such different ways.
Regional. Sometimes it gets kind of fuzzy if we're talking about databases like DynamoDB or Google Cloud Spanner. And before I even get into those, let's just talk about a regular relational database service like RDS. And I think Google's is Cloud SQL. I really prefer the names in Google Cloud, they're just a bit more intuitive. But with a regional database service, you have your world map and you have your database service hosted in a certain region. Even though it can be partially managed, for example, like replicas, database backups, and a lot of things can be managed for you by the cloud provider, it's still.
So he's just talking about how stuff that Redis does, the replica stuff system in Redis is actually quite good. I mean, I'm not being paid by Redis. I think it's just awesome technology, and people underestimate what its capabilities are. Because you just learn one, and you can just keep. You don't have to keep going and doing all kinds of crazy stuff.
In a single region, and it'll be serving traffic probably
Fast.
around the world. So some places in the world are going to receive data a little bit slower. Usually it doesn't matter though. But when you get into global databases, these are super, super powerful because.
Right, and we're not. I'm not expecting a regional business, to have to deal with this global system stuff. So, I'm kind of like tuning this part out, even though I know how it works.
They actually manage sharding and replication for you, and they distribute your data all around the world. Even though it's distributed around the world, they will work together. Generally, your request will be routed to the nearest location. The power of a global database is huge. Even though most people probably won't need it.
Right. We won't need it. We're not going to worry about that. And if the people you're gonna like sell your business to, they'll still worry about it. But we don't.
Is very powerful in just handling the scale for you and making the latency as small as possible.
See, a lot of the things about making these regional apps, you don't have to worry about the scaling super hard, because we're not going to scale that much. We don't need to. We only got like 5 people. We don't need 3 people. We got 3 people, so we're good. We don't need to scale to. We just need to dominate our area and make sure that the bigger players are nervous because we don't do more.
Because data is stored as close to the user as possible, kind of like with a content delivery network. And generally, you'll find that global services usually cost more, and managed cloud services also cost more because the more work that the cloud provider does for you, the more they're going to charge you, of course. Sometimes it's worth it, though. Like, this is a very hard problem to solve. You probably don't want to implement your own global database by yourself. You probably just want to pay somebody to do it for you. This is a lot of open-ended discussion, but I think that's what's most important. I could have gone into an example of one of these cloud providers, but looking at it from a high level, I think is most important, and getting hands-on with it, which is something we didn't do, is something I'd also recommend to you. Like, don't just watch me talk about this stuff. Try using some of these services. Try.
I mean, the stuff that JetBrains has about KTOR and how to set that stuff up, that's all you need to know. Once you understand how KTOR works and how like Postgres database, it's just another server running, accessing files. Once you know how it works, it's all the same stuff over and over again. And people, and that's the thing that's also been annoying, is coming back into this field and seeing how much marketing hype and how much people like really think they know what's going on with this stuff and will repeat ridiculous things about it. And then, you always come out, but no, it's just a computer somewhere with a database with with a file storage on it and some RAM. It's just another computer somewhere. That's all it is. It's never anything other than that. Nope, that's all it is. All right, go give NeetCode.io a like and subscribe. He's a good sport. And give me a like, subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.